They had been in the Moonwood for a fortnight when Bellatrix first allowed herself the dangerous thought that she might remain. Not forever. She was not so foolish as to believe in forever. But long enough that the old shape of her life no longer pressed so insistently upon her bones. Long enough that the road behind her had begun, in small and merciful ways, to forget her name. Their camp lay in a shallow hollow where the ground dipped as though the earth itself had grown weary and chosen once to rest. It was no strong place, nor was it fair to look upon, yet it had become a home of sorts, fashioned not by claim or conquest but by use. Straps were mended there. Bread was broken there. Watches were taken up and relinquished without word, as naturally as breath passing from one set of lungs to another. No horn marked the hours. No order was spoken, yet each night the fire was banked, each morning it was coaxed awake again, and the work of living resumed as if the world expected it. Garn Copperknot's pot hung always at the heart of the camp, blackened and patient. It seemed to know, in some quiet way, when voices were about to rise, or when silence needed company, and would answer with steam, or the sharp scent of herbs at just the right moment. Mira Knucklebone kept time without sound, her baton resting easy in her hand, her listening so exact that even pauses felt guided rather than empty. Rook passed in and out of the trees like a mark of grammar in a long sentence, seldom announced, always necessary. Where she went the forest bent a little, then straightened again, as though acknowledging her passage and letting it go. Bellatrix watched these things and felt, slowly, a loosening within herself. The habits of the Eyrie did not leave her. They were too deeply set for that, but they softened as tools soften when they are finally laid down among people who do not fear their edge. She no longer measured every moment as a test, nor weighed each kindness for the debt it might demand. Here, warmth did not flare and vanish. It settled. It held. The Moonwood itself neither welcomed nor barred them. It watched. Sound moved oddly beneath its boughs, softened and rearranged, as if the forest preferred conversation to declaration. Paths suggested themselves and then withdrew, offended by certainty. Bellatrix learned to walk without insisting that the ground obey her, and in that learning found a discipline stranger and harder than any she had known, attention without mastery. At night, when the fire burned low and the canopy above them knit together into a living ceiling of leaf and shadow, Bellatrix would sit at the edge of the light and feel the ache of her wings where they folded tight against her back. She did not yet dare to stretch them. Space, she had learned early, was a language, and here she was still learning the grammar. Yet no one pressed her. No one demanded that she explain herself, or become smaller for the comfort of others. And so hope took root, not loud, not triumphant, but real. Thin as the first green shoot after frost, and no less stubborn for it. This might be a clean break, not redemption, not concealment, just a life that did not immediately close around her like a mould already cast. Behind her, the road had begun to fade. Ahead of her, for a little while longer, the fire still burned. The Moonwood did not speak its laws, yet they were known all the same. Sound behaved strangely beneath its boughs, as though each word were weighed before being allowed to travel. Laughter returned, softened. Footsteps lost their authority. Even the ring of metal seemed to hesitate, dulled not by moss or earth, but by some older courtesy that refused sharpness for its own sake. Bellatrix learned quickly that the forest disliked insistence. A path taken too often would grow uncertain, narrowing or fading as if offended by reliance. Another, scarcely noticed the day before, might open without warning, offered briefly and without explanation. Nothing hunted them. Nothing reached from the dark with teeth or claw. Yet nothing promised safety either. The Moonwood was not a guardian set to watch over smaller lives. It was a presence that endured, and endurance, Bellatrix began to understand, was not the same as mercy. At first she waited for command, for the tightening pressure that had always preceded correction in the Eyrie. Her body remained coiled, ready to be measured, ready to be found wanting. But the forest did not test her in that way. It did not punish missteps with sudden violence, nor reward obedience with ease. Instead it required something more exacting, attention. When she moved without listening, the ground seemed subtly less willing beneath her feet. When she stilled herself and observed, the angle of trunks, the lay of fallen leaves, the small rearrangements of light, passage came more readily. It was not permission granted. It was cooperation earned moment by moment, and never guaranteed to last. This unsettled her more than threat would have. Restraint, she knew. She had been shaped by it, honed and held until even her fire learned to bank itself at the first hint of disapproval. Awareness was different. Awareness asked her to remain present without promise of reward, to notice without seeking advantage, to accept that the world did not exist to be mastered or corrected. Slowly, the habits of her training shifted. They did not fall away, they changed their posture. Discipline became choice. Readiness became listening. The fire in her chest no longer strained against its bounds, nor was it forced down into silence. It rested, waiting for a call that might never come, and was content, for now, to wait. The Moonwood did not demand obedience. It did not care whether she bent the knee or stood tall. It asked only that she see where she stood, and understand that standing was not the same as owning. For the first time since she could remember, Bellatrix felt herself acting, rather than being acted upon. Not free of danger, nor free of consequence, but free in the narrower and harder sense, able to choose how she met what lay before her. And the forest, having made no promises, allowed her to learn this at her own cost. For a time, the days held. Not without unease. There was always unease in the Moonwood, but it came in its proper measure, like cold that sharpens the air without killing the seed beneath it. The routines of the camp endured, the fire kindled and banked, the watches taken up at dusk and laid down at dawn, the small repairs that kept life from unravelling. Nothing here was careless, yet nothing was clenched. Fear existed, but it did not rule. It walked among them like a companion whose presence was noted and accounted for, not obeyed. At the forest's edge, tensions rose and fell. There were rumours carried in by runners and glances traded between trees, of men who cut too deeply, of paths that shifted when they ought not, of shadows that lingered where the moon found them too easily. Yet when the trouble came, the troop did not answer it with force or decree. They listened. They weighed. They shaped their response as one shapes a song, leaving space for breath and silence alike. Where others would have drawn lines in the earth and dared the world to cross them, they carried compromise in voice and motion, letting meaning travel where command could not. Bellatrix watched this and felt something unfamiliar settle within her. The habits of survival that had once been sharpened to an edge grew rounded, not dulled, but fitted to the hand. She saw how Mira bent without yielding, how Garn remembered for those who could not afford memory, how even danger could be named without being invited. The world did not break, because it was not forced to choose between obedience and ruin. It was then, at the quiet height of this balance, that the thought came to her, unbidden and unwelcome in its sweetness.
This might last.
Not forever, she told herself at once, for she knew better than to trust in unending things, but long enough to leave a mark that was not a scar. Long enough that what they were building, fragile though it was, might matter to someone beyond the turning of a season. The thought took root all the same, treacherous as hope always is. It grew not from triumph, but from continuity, from the simple, astonishing fact that morning followed night, and that when it did, the camp was still there. Above them the Moonwood stood, neither blessing nor forbidding. It had not promised to keep them. It had not warned them away. And in that unspoken allowance, Bellatrix felt the height of her hope, thin, precarious, and for that very reason, dear. It ended without herald or omen. There was no cry from the trees, no sudden flight of birds, no shudder of wind to warn those who knew how to listen. The fire burned as it had burned moments before. The Moonwood did not recoil. Yet the air tightened all the same, as if the world had drawn a careful breath and decided not to release it. Valerian stepped into the clearing, as one steps into a room, long prepared for one's arrival. He came with paladins in ordered formation, wings folded close, armor pale and undecorated, catching the low firelight and returning none of it. They did not fan out. They did not scan the trees or test the ground. Their order felt complete already, as if the shape of their presence had been decided before they ever crossed the forest's edge. Where they walked, the sense of possibility narrowed, not through threat, but through certainty. Bellatrix felt him before she saw him. The warmth she had learned to hold without fear drew inward at once, not extinguished but banked, like a hearth closed against a coming wind. Around her the camp stilled. Mira's baton lowered. Garn's song broke off mid-phrase. Even Alindra's restless light guttered and went quiet, as though the air itself had judged excess unwelcome. Valerian did not raise his voice when he spoke. There was no need. His tone carried the settled assurance of a thing long obeyed, not because it had shouted, but because it had been permitted to endure. He did not name them enemies. Enemies imply intention, and intention invites argument. Instead, he spoke of effects, of accumulation, of influence left unmeasured and therefore unaccountable, stories that altered perception, songs that softened boundaries, movement without record. He named these not as sins, nor even as errors, but as variables, unstable elements within a system that required clarity to survive. When his gaze turned to Bellatrix, it did not soften. She was not accused of betrayal. Betrayal suggests loyalty broken. What he offered instead was diagnosis. Exposure to warmth, he said, had compromised her judgment. Affection unregulated had altered her capacity for necessary action. This was not her fault. It was predictable. Systems that tolerated unmeasured closeness always paid for it later, and it was the duty of governance to ensure that payment did not become catastrophe. He spoke then of the mountain, not in reverence, nor in challenge, but as one speaks of a closed ledger. Argentus remained bound. There would be no correction from above, no answering weight to fall and balance the scales. Those days were finished. What remained was administration. Valerian did not threaten. He did not condemn. He did not promise. He simply stated what would occur, as winter states itself upon the land, without malice, without haste, and without appeal. The Moonwood listened. It did not move to bar his passage. It did not rise in defense or recoil in warning. It stood as it had always stood, ancient and attentive, offering neither shelter nor refusal now. And in that stillness, Bellatrix understood, with a clarity that cut deeper than fear, that what had come among them was not an enemy to be fought, but a necessity that believed itself beyond judgment. Fire cracked softly. The space for choice began to close. The order was never spoken, yet it passed among the paladins as surely as a breath passes from lung to lung. They moved. There was no shout, no clash of steel raised for terror's sake. Blades came free with scarcely a sound, as if sound itself had been judged unnecessary. Wings remained folded. Each step was measured, not cautious, not hurried, but exact, like the turning of a well-made key in a lock whose shape it had always known. Mira Knucklebone saw it first. Her baton lifted by reflex, not in command, but in instinct, the old habit of keeping time honest rising to meet danger before thought could follow. She opened her mouth, perhaps to speak, perhaps only to breathe, and a paladin closed the distance with the economy of one cutting rope already measured for length. There was no flourish. The blade struck, and Mira fell where she stood, her body meeting the forest floor as if it had simply been asked to stop. The baton slipped from her hand, rolled once, and came to rest half-buried in leaf mould. Its work done. Garn Copperknot rose from her place by the fire, a song still half-formed in her throat. For a heartbeat Bellatrix thought she might finish the line, might cast one last crooked verse into the air as defiance or blessing. But Garn did not beg, and she did not sing. She turned instead toward Bellatrix, as though to pass something unseen, a rhythm, a memory, a final instruction carried not in words but in presence, and then the blade found her. Her copper rings flashed once in the firelight, bright as a hearth remembered in winter, and then she was still. The pot swung gently on its hook, unheeding, steam lifting into the night as though nothing had been unmade. The others fell in swift succession, each death clean and terrible in its appropriateness. Silveril's fingers flew to her fiddle, not to play but to weave. A shimmer rose in the air, a bending of sight, the beginning of a path that might have brought a breath, a step, a chance. It was delicate, exact, and for a moment Bellatrix felt the old, foolish surge of hope that the world might yet be persuaded. The paladin stepped through the illusion as one steps through smoke. It collapsed with a small, almost embarrassed sound, as if ashamed of having hoped. Silveril's eyes widened, not in fear, but in surprise that precision had not been enough, and then she too was corrected. Brother Gerron did not reach for a weapon. He never did. He reached instead for a shoulder, an arm, the instinctive human motion of drawing another living thing away from harm. He was struck down in the act of care. His small ledger fell open in the dirt, pages lifting and settling like pale leaves in a breath of wind. Names lay there. Dates, kindnesses recorded without ceremony. The account of warmth scattered and began already to return to the earth. Veshka of the reeds made a sound that was not a scream but a call, low, layered, meant for root and insect and hidden creature. For a heartbeat, the forest stirred, not in anger, not in defense, in attention, as though something vast had turned its head, curious but undecided. Then the blade severed the call at its source. Veshka fell and the forest's attention slipped away again, unwilling or unable to intervene. Sister Olindra's wild magic flared as fear spiked into instinct. Sparks leapt. Frost gathered. The air brightened with unpredictable life, with all the unruly possibility that had made her dangerous and beloved in equal measure. For an instant Bellatrix felt, absurdly, treacherously, that the world itself might crack open and refuse this. The paladins moved through the chaos as through weather. A blade struck a joint. Another followed. Olindra's light sputtered and went out, leaving only the smell of metal and spent possibility. Rook was already running because she had always treated survival as a practice rather than a belief. She did not look back. A paladin turned, measured the distance, and threw. The sound was small. Rook's body went down hard, and the path out of the clearing closed behind her with a finality that did not require a door. The troop fell as if a list were being checked. Bellatrix stood rooted, the fire in her chest surging and demanding release, but her body held it fast. Years of discipline closed around her instinct like iron bands. She had been taught to bank her flame, to swallow even her own scream if sound would not serve. Now that training betrayed her, turning her into a witness when every fibre of her being demanded rupture. And in that stillness, she understood. This was not fear of disorder that moved Valerian's hand. Disorder can be crushed, hunted, burned away. This was fear of adaptation, of living systems that bent instead of breaking, that listened instead of commanded, that proved domination unnecessary. What the troop had made here was not chaos, it was an answer, and answers that do not require control are intolerable to those who believe control is the only form of order. The paladins withdrew half a step and waited. Their blades were clean, their breathing was even. They did not look at the bodies, they did not look at one another. Their stillness was the stillness of a task completed. The fire continued to burn. The Moonwood did not cry out. It did not close its paths or rise in fury. It stood as it had always stood, ancient and attentive, offering neither refusal nor shelter now. And Bellatrix understood, with a clarity that hollowed her, that the forest had never promised protection, only attention. Only then did she see the shape of what remained. Theo stood where he had been all along. He had not been touched. For a breath Bellatrix could not comprehend it. Her mind reached for explanations, error, delay, mercy, and found none that would hold. Then the pattern resolved itself, cold and exact. Theo was not spared by accident. He was spared because he was the point. Valerian turned toward him, at last, granting him the dignity of attention. Theo's hands were empty. His face was pale with shock, but he did not run. He did not beg. He looked once at Bellatrix, and in his eyes was not a plea for rescue, but for recognition, for proof that what they had lived had not already been reduced to a mistake. "You are not being punished," Valerian said, and his voice neither rose nor softened. Punishment presumes intent to wound or shame. What comes for you is cleaner than that lie. He spoke as one speaks to a room after order has been restored. "You are being removed," he continued, "as splinters are removed from beams that must bear weight beyond one life." Theo drew a breath, perhaps to speak, perhaps to sing, as if sound might yet lay a hand upon the world and persuade it to remember what it had been moments before, perhaps only to say her name. Valerian did not hurry him. "You were not evil," Valerian said, and this was colder than accusation. "You were a vector. Sound escaped your mouth and travelled where record and decree could not. Your voice dissolved borders we rely upon. That is not a gift. It is a liability." Bellatrix felt the old language slide into place like hooks. Measure, necessity, outcome. "Affection persuades," Valerian went on. "It teaches hearts to trust unsanctioned warmth, to move without consent of higher rule. Such movement spreads. It cannot be counted. And what cannot be counted cannot stand." Theo's breath came shallow. Still Valerian waited. "You sang?" he said at last, and the word fell like a verdict, and systems shifted in response. Exceptions multiplied beneath your voice. The structure answered, as it always must. He drew breath. It was quiet, exact, careful, as a smith is careful when quenching a blade. What came forth was winter. Not a storm's roar, but the sudden arrival of cold so complete it felt, for a heartbeat, like absence. Frost bloomed across Theo's chest and throat at once, not creeping, not seeking, but arriving whole, as if it had always been there and was only now permitted to be seen, his breath caught. His eyes widened, not in pain, for there was scarcely time for pain, but in the startled recognition of a door closing. He stood a moment longer than his body had any right to, held upright by habit alone. Then habit failed. Theo fell, and the sound of his body meeting the earth was heavy and final, like a stone set down and left. Bellatrix felt it more than she heard it. Something in her tore free, not with spectacle, not with sound, but cleanly, like cloth held too taut for too long. She stepped forward because the body knows its rituals: reach, catch, hold, undo. Warmth moves toward cold, life toward life. Every part of her demanded the right to return what had been taken. Valerian's presence pressed down, not as force, not as threat, but as certainty. Motion would change nothing. The world had already decided what it would be, and would not consult her grief. The paladins did not lift their blades. They did not need to. Their stillness was the stillness of completion. Theo was dead. Bellatrix did not scream. The sound rose and struck the walls she had built over a lifetime. Walls of doctrine and discipline, built to keep disaster contained, and rebounded inward instead. Blood filled her mouth where she bit her tongue. Her knees locked. She would not fall. She would not give Valerian the small satisfaction of watching her collapse into manageability. Valerian watched her for a few breaths, measuring not her sorrow but the structure beneath it. Satisfied, he turned away. "Correction has been applied," he said. "Further instability will be addressed as required." He did not look back. Only when the paladins had withdrawn into the trees, their ordered silence thinning into another absence, did Bellatrix's body remember that it no longer needed to stand. She fell to her knees, beside Theo. She pressed her hand to his chest as if warmth might still be called back by contact alone. The frost did not soften. It held. Words would not come. Only air, torn and soundless. Laughter broke the silence. It was so ill-placed a sound that for a moment Bellatrix believed it had risen from within herself, some final crack in the stone of endurance that had held through fire and frost alike. It rang out lightly, almost brightly, edged not with mirth but with irritation, as though someone had arrived late to a solemn council and found the seating poorly arranged. The Moonwood, which had softened every voice that night, and bent each sound to its own quiet judgment, allowed this one to pass untouched, granting it neither echo nor mercy. From the dark between the trees, Nesixia stepped into the clearing. She did not tear the veil of the world, nor call attention to herself with thunder or flame. She arrived as one arrives at a place long anticipated, as though the ground itself had been prepared in advance and now fulfilled its purpose. The firelight reached for her and failed to warm her, tracing instead the clean and exact lines of her form, as light traces the edge of a blade set upon a table. She was tall and spare, and there was nothing hurried in her bearing. Excess seemed a thing she had long ago discarded as unbecoming. She stood among the fallen and regarded them without haste and without reverence. Her gaze moved from body to body, not lingering on faces but counting absences, as one might take account after a storm has passed, and the reckoning cannot be delayed. "Well," she said at last, her voice clear and even, carrying easily through the ruin, "that is inconvenient." The word fell into the clearing and settled there, small and final, like a stone dropped into deep water. Bellatrix turned toward her, and the fire in her chest flared so fiercely that the edges of the world blurred. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but Nesixia framed by blood-dark leaves and trampled earth, and every lesson of restraint Bellatrix had ever learned rose up together, clamouring to be cast aside. Nesixia lifted one hand. The gesture was slight and almost careless, yet it held the space as surely as any. Command. It called for no force, and promised none, but memory answered it all the same.
"Easy," she said. "I am not the one who did this."
She lowered her hand and walked among the dead, her steps measured and unhurried. She chose her path with a practised eye, stepping where the firelight fell cleanest, where the ground had not yet been darkened by blood. She stopped beside Theo's body and looked down upon him, her head tilted a fraction, as though listening for a sound that had already fled the world.
"A shame," she continued. "He had such a useful voice."
The words struck Bellatrix with a cold precision. that cut deeper than any blade. Understanding slid into place with the dreadful ease of a truth long suspected and carefully avoided.
Purchased, Nesixia went on, as if completing a thought already begun. Among other considerations, he wished to sing truths that mattered, and to have those truths travel farther than a single firelight. Admirable, reckless, always the same combination.
She crouched then, examining the frost that sealed Theo's stillness, her gaze tracing its clean, merciless lines.
A voice like that moves people. It alters behavior. It opens doors that were not meant to be opened. That makes it valuable. She straightened again, brushing soil from her hand, as one might after closing a ledger. It also makes it dangerous.
Bellatrix felt her grief harden, sharpened by clarity, into something that burned with direction. "You let him die," she said, and the words tore themselves free of her throat like splinters drawn from flesh.
Nesixia inclined her head, the smallest possible acknowledgement. Neither apology nor denial. "Contracts are not shields," she replied. "I did not arrange this. I merely suffer the consequence. Overzealous administrators have a habit of excising what they cannot catalogue." She glanced once more at the scattered bodies, and her mouth tightened, not with sorrow, but with irritation. "Still," she said, "this is a great deal of wasted potential."
The cruelty of it lay not in revelation, but in confirmation. Nothing Nesixia spoke contradicted what Bellatrix already knew in the hollow place behind her ribs. It named it cleanly, stripped of the small mercies of doubt and the false comfort of uncertainty. Theo had been purchased. Theo had been useful. Theo had been dangerous. Theo had never been protected. Bellatrix sank to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the frost-bound stillness of his chest. She did not expect warmth to return, yet her body insisted on the gesture all the same, as bodies always do when the mind has already been outpaced by loss. The cold did not yield. It held him fast, perfect and final. Around them the Moonwood stood in silence. It did not recoil. It did not rise in anger or sorrow. It remained as it had always remained, ancient and attentive, offering neither condemnation nor comfort. The forest had listened when it could act, and now, when it could not, it did not pretend otherwise. Nesixia watched Bellatrix with an interest that sharpened as grief deepened. She waited, patient as stone, until Bellatrix lifted her head.
"You counted him," Bellatrix said hoarsely, "like an object."
Nesixia's lips curved, not unkindly, but without warmth. "Everything that endures is counted by someone," she said. "Those who believe otherwise merely do not know whose ledger they are written."
She stepped closer then, close enough that Bellatrix could feel the strange tempered chill beneath her presence, a cold that was not absence but restraint perfected. Nesixia's shadow fell across Theo's body and did not tremble.
"He was not deceived," Nesixia said. "He knew the nature of the bargain. He wanted his voice to matter. He wanted reach, influence, consequence. He understood the risk." Her gaze flicked, briefly, to the place where Valerian had stood. "He simply misjudged who would decide the price."
Bellatrix's hands curled into the earth. "And you?" she asked. "What do you decide?"
For the first time since her arrival, Nesixia hesitated, not from doubt, but from interest. She studied Bellatrix with a new attention, as one studies a piece on a board whose movement has not yet been anticipated.
"I decide what remains useful," she said at last, "and what may yet be moved." She straightened and looked out across the clearing, taking in the extinguished fire, the scattered instruments, the broken shapes of a life dismantled with care. "This place," she said, "is finished. Forces that cannot tolerate listening have taken note of you. Staying here would be inefficient."
Bellatrix rose unsteadily to her feet. The fire in her chest, long banked and disciplined, burned now with a steadier heat, stripped of illusion. She looked once more at Theo, then at the trees, then at Nesixia. The forest did not speak. It did not forbid her leaving. It did not urge her to stay. Nesixia's eyes returned to her, bright with calculation and something like anticipation. She smiled, not cruelly, but with the satisfaction of one who sees the final piece align.
"There are paths," she said softly, "that do not pass through sanctuaries or libraries, places where disappearance is an art and survival a trade." Her gaze sharpened. "If you wish to continue, Bellatrix, you will need such a place."
The Moonwood stood behind her, green and silent, already beginning its slow work of forgetting. Ahead lay the world again, harsh and loud and hungry, and between them, in the space where grief hardened into motion, Nesixia waited, having said enough.
Nesixia did not speak at once. She stood at the edge of the ruined clearing as one stands at a crossroads already mapped, her gaze turned not toward the fallen, but toward the dark spaces between the trees where paths were made and unmade without notice. The moonwood breathed around them, patient as ever, already drawing leaf and shadow back over the scars of violence. It would endure. It always did. Endurance was never the same as refuge. When she spoke, it was not to explain. "Answers," she said calmly, "come later. They require time, and time is precisely what you no longer possess."
Bellatrix listened, standing very still. The bargain still burned behind her ribs, not painfully but insistently, like a compass needle that had found its bearing and refused to be ignored. She did not ask what answers Nesixia meant. She had learned, in the hardest way, that answers offered too early were often traps in fine clothing.
"What you need now," Nesixia continued, "is movement."
She turned then, her cloak whispering softly against the ground, and gestured. Not toward any visible path, but toward a narrow place where the forest thinned almost imperceptibly, where shadow gave way to a darker shadow that felt less like listening and more like indifference.
"This place," she said, "is no longer survivable for you. Not because it failed, not because its way was wrong, but because systems that cannot tolerate listening have noticed you, and such systems do not forget."
Bellatrix felt the truth of it settle with grim clarity. The Moonwood had not betrayed her. It had done exactly what it had always done, offered attention, demanded awareness, allowed passage without promise. It was Valerian's world that had no patience for such things, a world that required obedience, accountability, correction, a world that would return again and again until the lesson was complete.
"The first step," Nesixia said, "is not enlightenment. It is disappearance."
The word did not frighten Bellatrix as she might once have expected. Disappearance had been Rook's craft, not a vanishing born of fear, but a practiced refusal to be where one was expected. There were worse fates than not being found. They did not linger. Nesixia moved with unhurried certainty, and Bellatrix followed, her wings folded tight, her steps measured to match the other woman's pace. The forest did not bar them. It did not bless them. Branches shifted aside where necessary and closed again behind them, already erasing the shape of their passing. No farewell marked their leaving. No benediction was offered. The Moonwood required none. As they walked, Bellatrix felt the weight of the place fall from her, not at once, not cleanly, but in layers, like armor unbuckled piece by piece. She did not think of what she left behind as loss. She thought of it as proof. Proof that another way had existed. Proof that listening could shape survival. Proof that warmth need not always be a weakness. The forest did not follow. By the time the air began to change, by the time damp loam gave way to the sharper tang of salt carried on distant wind, Bellatrix understood that they had crossed a boundary more decisive than any line drawn on a map.
Only then did Nesixia name their direction. "Luskan," she said.
The word carried weight, and not the honest weight of stone or mountain. It carried the weight of coin, of crowded docks and shouting sailors, of contracts sealed with ink that washed away easily if one knew the tide. Bellatrix had heard of the city, as most had, a place where law bent under commerce, where allegiance was temporary, and where morality was treated as a private hobby best not displayed too openly. They crested a low rise, and the Moonwood lay behind them now, its canopy thick and dark, its presence already retreating into memory. Ahead, the land sloped downward toward human noise, roads beaten flat by wagons, the distant clang of iron, the smell of smoke, not born of hearths, but of industry.